Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of What a Hell of a Way to Die. You got me, you got Nate, you got Adrian, and we have a special guest. Adrian is off in Italy, and he has found himself a Italian? No, he's an American. We've got another American because Americans can't stop being everywhere. So, Adrian, tell us all about our stand-in guest here.
Sure. So our guest is Dave James, who's a writer, philosopher, teacher of English, and mountain climber. And I met him at my first unit, SECO, first to the 503rd, 173rd Airborne.
Boy.
And I remember, so he was the fire support officer, very intellectual. And I just remember him being, super intense. And similarly interested in things that didn't necessarily relate exactly to the military. And so we struck up a friendship when we were both serving here. And after I left the unit, he left the unit and left the military and stayed here. And he's been in Vicenza ever since. From what I can tell, just living an extraordinary life in the mountains, drinking good red wine, and eating fresh fruit, and climbing the mountains.
Thank you, Adrian. Very great introduction. Happy to be here. You guys have a good podcast.
It's going to be an interesting one because we're going to talk and we're going to discuss open carry, closed carry, conceal and carry, and all of the various ways that we are all from different areas. Myself in Missouri, Nate's up in New York, but also dual citizen in England. Adrian in Connecticut, but also Ukraine. And then we got David, who's an American. Now, what state are you originally from?
I'm from South Carolina, actually. So, representing the whole South here, I think.
Right. And you're an officer too, right? Or a former officer? Yeah, fantastic.
Yes.
Another goddamn officer. Okay. That's fine. So we're going to talk guns, and we're going to discuss really just everything. We all, like I said, we all come from different backgrounds with guns. To kind of give you my background, I never really touched a gun until I joined the military at 17, and really went to basic training at 18. I shot a .22 in Boy Scout camp when I was like 12, and then never touched a gun again. And for some reason, I am a huge fan of guns now. But I also had guns correctly beaten into me by the military, because you go out when your first experience with a gun is a fucking 249 machine gun or an M16. That's pretty badass. So I really got into them, but I also had a background of a drill sergeant behind me screaming, "God damn it, Horton, if you fucking get out of your lane again, I'm going to throw you into the fucking grenade pit with a grenade." So I had a lot of good habits beaten into me. Nate, how about yourself?
Well, the first time I ever shot a gun was a M60 machine gun, and I was 3 years old. I'm serious. At a family day event for my dad's unit at Fort Ord, California. But, I never shot a gun again until I think I was 11 years old, and went with some family friends to a not hunting trip, but the sort of out to a hunting lodge visit, and got to fire a shotgun. I thought it was the coolest thing ever. In fact, I thought guns were awesome when I was, 9, 10, 11 years old. And so much that I wrote about them one time and elicited a lot of concern from my teachers when I was very enthusiastic about guns. I imagine that had I been, born in 1994 instead of 1984, I probably would have gotten marked for termination in a lot of ways, because I was just really interested in guns. Had that very, very forcibly disabused by my parents, and I kind of stopped caring about them. And then I became an infantry officer. Also, I point out that I grew up all over, but my dad retired in Indiana. And in Indiana, guns are a thing, handguns are a thing, but high-powered rifles aren't as much of a thing for hunting, because it's mostly flat. And as a result, most of the hunting weapons people use are crossbows. Because if you're going to hunt deer, it's a bit of a challenge to do that with the low-caliber rifles that you can fire in a state that's that flat. And as a result, the hunting culture oriented around guns wasn't that big of a thing. I mean, everybody I knew that hunted with bows, and the only guns I ever really saw were, people like when you were at high school, you knew people whose parents had guns where they kept them in their houses because, of course, their kids knew. Um, then I joined the infantry and got to shoot guns a lot and have tried to be as respectful and as professional with them as I could be. But I don't own any. I mean, you can own them in New York City. It's not impossible. I know people that own handguns. I know people who own shotguns for hunting. It's a pretty rigorous process to get them. But I have never really expressed an interest in getting one because I just don't think I would ever use it. And I think that even though I like to think of myself as being completely even keeled all the time, statistically speaking, you're far more likely to commit suicide or harm someone you love or have someone accidentally harm themselves in your household if you have a gun. And since I have no need for one, I just don't own one. And then also you mentioned is true. My mom is originally from Britain. Her dad was an American airman stationed in Britain, and they had a GI marriage, and her mom was English. And as a result, I'm a dual citizen. And one of the reasons why I, to be perfectly honest, feel much safer when I am in Britain is the fact that guns are there, but they're far less common. They're far harder to get. And I'll leave you with this story. I mean, I've had experiences. I had a guy pull a gun on me in Alaska because he was drunk and thought I was breaking into his house. I was a friend of his friend who was there. I had road rage incident in Anchorage where I thought I was going to get shot by some angry redneck. Unfortunately, I hadn't looked before I merged and, cut him off. I have seen incidents. I've had soldiers commit suicide. I've had soldiers who had to respond to suicides because of people who'd come back from deployment or even on deployment. Hearing their stories made me much more wary of it. But also, I mean, when I was a little kid living in Germany, a guy got shot. Someone got murdered on a bus stop about 2 towns away from me with a handgun. And it was the biggest story you could possibly imagine. Like, it was in the news for months after the fact. And the reason was because it was such an uncommon thing. And I remember, this is kind of embarrassing, but being 7, 8 years old, was visiting with an American couple, like family friends, and they had a son who was older who I thought was really cool when I was 7, and I tried to impress him, like, you're not going to believe this story. This guy got shot. Now, this kid had grown up in America. He was living in Spain temporarily because his dad was stationed there. And he was like, what? That's stupid. Why do I care? That happens in America every day, like in every town, everywhere in America that happens. And that was the first time I think I kind of realized. I mean, it's strange to have that revelation when you're that young, but I remember thinking, oh, wow, that sucks. That's a bad thing. And the fact is, if you grow up in Europe, more or less, it's very uncommon to hear stories like that. And I don't think there's anywhere in the developed world that comes anywhere close to the level of gun carnage we have in America.
All right. And Adrian, how about yourself?
Well, so growing up in Connecticut with very liberal parents near New Haven, which is a particularly liberal place in Connecticut, because there are places in Connecticut that are not, that are more rural and have the political identities and social identities of rural areas, which is to say much more permissive toward gun use. But the only time I saw a gun growing up was probably when between the age of 10 and 12, and or however old I was in Cub Scouts, when we went to a state patrol police station, and there was an officer there, and we got to see the K9 unit, and we got to hold one of the officer's pistols, and that was my only experience with guns until I joined the military, of course. And I was never nuts about guns, and I can't say that I am today either. Like I remember the first time I held a loaded M4, and my reaction to that was not excitement, but rather grave concern because of everything that I'd read about guns, and I felt in danger. I felt that one of any number of things, all of which had been elucidated by the drill sergeant, would happen to me. And I think that's like a really good going in point to guns, because, although I've seen guns used in anger, and I've read a lot about how they're used in anger and misused in the U.S., I do think that, ultimately the Second Amendment was a prudent amendment, even if it had... I've heard stories about how it was a lot of the idea behind it was racist, and it was sort of a way to keep guns out of the hands of slaves and in the hands of organized, like in the hands of the state or the powers that be. But the way it's been interpreted lately, up until the last couple of years anyway, is that it's important to have guns because on a certain level, politics is violence and you cannot control politically a population that is well armed. You always have a certain amount of resistance to totalitarianism or to anything really. And I think that resistance in principle is a good thing. And when Obama, I remember this, when President Obama was in charge and everyone was talking about gun rights, I was one of the few people who was saying like, well, what happens when the other shoe drops and it's not President Obama, but it's some hideous caricature of of a dictator. And suddenly, lo and behold, we're it feels like we're a lot closer to that now today than we were under President Obama. And a lot of people are saying like, well, we should have the right to be armed. We should have the right to be armed and to regulate ourselves as being armed apart from anything the government says or does. And I've nattered on for a little while. I want to add one quick point to this, which is that in Ukraine, there's a huge movement now to allow gun rights along similar lines to the US. And that's because in Ukraine, you have this very unusual situation where they got rid of their nuclear arsenal under guarantees from other governments to protect their territorial sovereignty, that being the US, the UK, and Russia. Then they prudently, because once one has gotten rid of one's massive nuclear arsenal, I can't remember if it was the third or fifth largest in the world, why do you really need an air force? And if you don't really need an air force, why do you really need a navy? And if you don't really need a navy, because if you needed a navy, surely you would have held on to those nuclear weapons. What do you need a huge army for? What do you need a huge so on and so forth? So you get to 2013, 2014, the military is 40,000 strong on paper, but practically speaking, it's between 6,000 and 7,000 strong in terms of well-armed, well-equipped, and well-trained soldiers. And then the unthinkable happens. You're invaded by one of the people who guaranteed your territorial sovereignty in exchange for the very nuclear weapons that you gave up. And so what happened for the first 5 or 6 months while the country was standing itself back up, standing its military up from a skeleton force to a force capable of going toe-to-toe with one of the world's only nuclear superpowers, you had a bunch of citizens essentially self-organize and volunteer for service in the front lines. These are the volunteer battalions, a few of which are ideologically extremist, but many of which were really just, engineers, lawyers, doctors, average citizens who did not want to be a part of Russia. And they brought their rifles and they brought their shotguns and they brought lead pipes in some cases. And they armed themselves in many cases with the weapons of the separatists that they felled. This is not propaganda. This isn't political exaggeration. It's a state and a people struggling for their existence. And I don't think it's hyperbole that the US is one of the few countries in the world that a place like Ukraine can look at and say, if we were like this, forget about the nukes, but if we were like this, we never would have been invaded. And the last thing I'll say before I hand it over to David, who I believe has excellent and philosophically grounded counterpoints to everything that I just said, is that is that gun control, what we're talking about, and this isn't a breaking news story here. Gun control just means the way we have it right now isn't good. And I think that's clear to everybody. The way we have it in America with the laws on the books isn't working. Sensible gun control is a no-brainer. We need to put laws on the books to further control how people buy and acquire weapons. I'm for that. I am pro gun control, but I do believe that access to weapons is a fundamental U.S. right, American citizen right. And I think that on a certain level, it may even be a human right, the right to self-defense. And threading that needle hasn't been very easy with opposition from the NRA. But hey, now that the NRA has exposed itself as a fraudulent and hypocritical partisan propaganda machine, maybe we can get some more work done in the Congress.
Yeah, and David, I am curious because how long did you say that you've been living in Italy?
For about 10 years now.
Okay, so 10 years, and I assume all the engines I hear running in the background are little scooters and people going by saying ciao.
Vespa.
Right. Yeah, a lot of Vespas, a lot of people saying ciao, drinking red wine. You mentioned before we started recording that there's a big difference between how you feel, safety-wise in Italy versus how you felt when you were in America. So if you could kind of reiterate that and kind of explain why that is, and if you do have an understanding of Italian gun laws as well, because I'm sure that you can in Italy. I'm sure if you wanted to, you could get a gun. I bet there's hunting and things like that. But how is it different than what it is in America?
Yeah, so just quickly on my background, I do come from the South, but probably is one of the few exceptions. I wasn't in a gun-loving family or anything like that, so I never really had much access or interest in guns until I joined the military. And obviously I learned how to use all the rifles and weapons necessary and qualified, but I've never had any love or need for guns in any way, my personal life. So, personally, I'm just a very strong gun control advocate. I'm not at the point yet where I've lived outside of the U.S. as long as I lived in the U.S. I need a few more years, but based in Europe 10 years now, I can safely say that it's a very peaceful society here in Italy. The people do have guns to hunt. Like I live in a small village now up in the hills, and there's actually quite a bit of hunting, but that's only 3 months of the year, and it's heavily controlled. And so what people would be using is some rifles. You have to pay a lot of taxes for it and, go through a lot of bureaucracy. And it does exist. But as far as handguns, I've never actually even heard of those around here. Obviously, I'm sure they exist, and maybe much more in the south of Italy, which I don't know so much about, but there's more of a mafia presence, and it's almost a different society. But overall, it's very peaceful here. It would be huge news to hear of someone getting murdered with a gun anywhere in the area. I've never heard of it. There's never been any type of mass shooting that I know about in decades. Part of that is the gun culture, which doesn't exist here. Part of it is that they have had 2 world wars on their soil and redid their whole society after that in ways that's never happened in the U.S. exactly. Obviously, there's no equivalent to the Second Amendment in Italy, or really anywhere in Europe, I think. I mean, I'm not the expert for every country. But so basically, I would probably disagree a bit with some of Adrian's position about the philosophical necessity of having guns to defend yourself individually from a potential future totalitarian government. It sounds good, but I'm just not really convinced. I mean, if it comes to that, is it really going to be a handgun or a rifle that's, stopping us? I don't think so. It's going to be sorts of passive resistance by a huge mass of people or non-cooperation, other movements which are generally peaceful, or something beyond just, that I have a handgun and open carry or whatever else it is. So I disagree with that a bit. But otherwise, I do feel safer here in my daily life, I would say. Having my kids who will be starting school soon, like I'm not worrying about a school shooting, which is about a once a week occurrence in America. So, I mean, as much as I do like America in many ways, and it's better than many other countries, one thing is very clear by statistics and anecdotal evidence is that it's super violent, more than anywhere in the world, basically, for gun violence.
Now, we do talk about, the way that a lot of these rallies they end up getting protected by some of they call themselves 3%ers or some of the oath keepers, basically the dudes that went to the local Uncle Sam's and bought a bunch of cast off military uniforms and some plate carriers and some dropped $3,000 on a rifle and go out and they stand around and they try to look tough and they protect the Nazis and then everybody goes home. And And I know ideologically in America, there is this mentality of one day we might have to, take our rifles outside and shoot down the hellfires that are getting shot at us, and or whatever thing that these people have got in their minds that lets them think, yes, I need a gun to go against the MRAPs. But as Adrian was talking about, Ukrainian gun control and the need for guns in Ukraine versus needs of guns in Italy or need of guns in France, especially in 2017. And I know that as you were talking about, David, on the philosophical side, it's different, but Ukraine has it. I guess in a way, I kind of compare it to the need for nuclear arms as well. Like in a way, I understand why North Korea wants nuclear arms, because as Adrian was just saying, the Ukrainians gave up their nukes and then they got fucked. If the North Koreans give up their nukes, do they get fucked as well? And can we bring this back down to gun control as well?
Also, the Libyans gave up their nukes, and you saw what happened there too. Which is not to say that I am a supporter of Gaddafi. It's just more that obviously geopolitical things can change pretty severely when you no longer have this ultimate deterrence, if you want to call it that. And it's strange because that makes somebody sound like a proponent for nuclear weapons, but I understand that argument. I just think that David, I'll totally let you respond in a second. I just wanted to point out that I feel, from my perspective, arming yourself and justifying possession of arms in case of a hypothetical situation that's utterly catastrophic and basically world-ending, or at least world inverting, it seems like a very high price, to pay when you consider that along with that comes all of the daily violence and the risk of problems, and this culture that has effectively said that we refuse to do anything even when 7-year-old school children are being murdered en masse.
Yeah, no, and definitely I don't think on America's side that we need to have. I absolutely believe in stricter gun control. Too many yahoos can get a hold of guns as it is. But as we were talking about, the difference between Ukraine, who has Russia at their back door, kicking their back door in now. Though we can't say Russia; they're separatists that just happen to be very, very well trained, as if they were Russian military. Versus, as you said, David, in Italy, do you think that there is kind of a philosophically, at least, a reason, or that there is okay, maybe Ukraine does need that, maybe the North Korea does need something like that, maybe in Afghanistan, where every family is allowed one AK-47 legally, because you got to protect your shit. Like, is that does the means of peaceful protest, as you bring up, would you suggest that elsewhere as well?
Yeah, well, is it peaceful protest we're talking about, or is it resisting potential dictatorship? It's sort of a different thing. I was just thinking a little bit also about the nuclear weapons comparison, which is interesting because hypothetically, what if we imagine every country in the world which has nuclear weapons? It's not such a different argument to what if every person in the US has a gun. So do we feel safer in that situation or not? I mean, personally, I know I don't. Obviously, there's some differences, but we probably want to keep it more on guns than the nuclear question. But, in America, not everybody has a gun, but it's still, the number of guns is basically the same as the population. And obviously, a huge percentage of people have guns. I think it's the highest in the world of individual ownership. But does anyone necessarily feel safer because of that? I don't think so necessarily. And I think every statistic would show that also the most homicides or accidents also come from the people owning the guns, and also enormous numbers of children having accidents, or people who are not supposed to have access to the gun who take it and do something and kill somebody. So I think it's a false argument that it makes you safer. The question of resisting tyranny is another thing besides self-defense, but I personally don't buy any of it. I think it's just sort of a propaganda thing. Adrian,
And I do. I was going to say I do agree because I'm from a state, I'm from Missouri, where the one of the ideas to protect against school shootings was an idea was floated to just give every teacher a gun, which was like the dumb right, which is one of the biggest reasons my wife and I are thinking about homeschooling because we see kids that have to do active shooter drills in America, and like that doesn't ping anybody in their head. Like the thing is either well that's our new normal, or damn it, I wish I could send my kid to school with with my 380 in their pocket so that if necessary my 10-year-old can gun down the other 10-year-old that's gunning down all the other kids. Like it seems like a weird tick that we have now that the only way to solve guns is more guns, which is fucking stupid and bullshit.
And that we're the only developed country on the planet that seems to have this problem and seems to be unable to come up with a solution.
Well, and I think it's important not to understate how little has been done to control guns. And that's important to me because I agree with everything that you guys have said about, the violent consequences, the culture, the fetishization of gun ownership, of violence, all of these things. And we've done almost nothing to control this. And I know that it's a big talking point on the left, not the left, in progressive circles whenever, somebody, the school shooting was carried out by somebody who took the weapons from their father, their mother, who had purchased the weapons legally. And it's, purchasing the weapons legally means, driving a state or two over and going to, buying a fully loaded AK-47 with man-stopper ammunition, off of the back of a pickup truck for cash. That's legal in some places. So saying that weapons were acquired legally is an artful dodge for the nothing that we've done to control the sale and possession of guns. I think a lot more needs to be done with that. But I also don't feel that really infringes on citizens' rights the way the NRA said that it did, 2 or 3 years ago. Again, before the NRA exposed itself as this sort of like hyper-partisan reactionary organization. The NRA said that it wanted, it said that mental health checks, this is a huge talking point for them in around the Newtown shooting, for example. Said that, mental health was a huge problem. We needed to focus on mental health, but it was so important that anybody be allowed to own a weapon that you couldn't even do mental health background checks on somebody. Because what if a tyrannical government decided that, being a Democrat was a mental health issue, or loving America was a mental health issue? And at the time, right, maybe it is. I don't think it is. If it is, then I'm guilty. I'm one of those mental health people. But now the NRA has these these videos where people are it's the Antifa, it's Black Lives Matter. That's these people might be armed, so you have to arm yourself. And it's like, I get it. I understand what you're getting at with that. So it's not about that at all. You're just sort of reactionary.
Well, a couple things I want to point out. For one, California had open carry, and the thing that made them change their laws was the Black Panthers demonstrating with rifles. And then all of a sudden, California changed its laws, and they couldn't have open carry anymore. But something I'd point out, too, is that, when I talk about proposals with people, when I think about what gun control would look like in America, oftentimes it's really things like closing the gun show loophole, normalizing laws across state lines, making it so it's because I'll give you an example. In New York City, we have an issue where folks buy guns from other states and bring them up here. And in one case, there was actually a great big police investigation where they discovered that people were buying guns at gun shows in Georgia, and there were people working on the inside of Atlanta, Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, and New York's LaGuardia Airport, and were actually handing off duffel bags full of guns and using them in their carry-on baggage, flying them into New York twice a week, and that's how hundreds and hundreds of these guns were getting onto the streets in New York so quickly from Georgia. No one was driving them up; they were literally being flown in. So things like that were happening, and that was a huge organized crime loophole. So I feel like closing some of these loopholes, making the laws standard, that you could see progress in terms of stopping people from getting guns. I think mandatory waiting periods, even in places where people love guns, you'll find proponents of those because people who sell guns or around guns have all heard stories of someone who goes to a gun store, buys a gun, and then commits suicide an hour later or a day later. And that really fucks with the people who sell guns too. I mean, in the sense that there are problems and they're not intractable. It's just that I think the NRA also had a lot of its momentum in opposing these things from the kind of insane paranoid delusions that many people had about President Obama, where it was kind of wrapped up in the same kind of conspiracy theorizing that you were just describing, Adrian, with the NRA's videos. But also something I would point out is that to me, watching, I'll give you a little background for me. A little over a year ago, I published what it was effectively a personal essay in the New York Times Magazine describing my own experience with M4s and AR-15s, and the fact that my argument was I don't think there's any real need for one as a civilian in America, that guns are guns and you might have a use for a hunting rifle, you might have a use for a pistol, you might have a variety of needs, but an AR-15 has no real purpose besides killing the enemy on the battlefield. The bullets are small but very powerful. They don't necessarily have stopping power. They overpenetrate. And they're not particularly good for hunting. They're certainly not sporting for hunting unless you're just killing animals that, what you would call pests. And so as a result, the only reason why I could envision someone would feel as though they needed one is if they felt they were in a war zone and they needed to arm themselves appropriately, because that's what they're there for. And I bring this up because the responses that I received were so vehement and kind of pitched in a way that it varied everything from you've betrayed your oath to the Constitution as an officer because you're, all the way to people very avidly encouraging me to commit suicide. In one case, a kid who encouraged me to commit suicide also had his social media decked out with the 22 push-up a day challenge to prevent veteran suicide, which I found somewhat ironic, that a person who has made it a point to signal to their friends that they believe veterans, this is an active duty Marine, who want to signal to their friends that that veterans should not commit suicide, is telling me to kill myself. And the conclusion that I arrived at was more that to some people, guns and the hypothetical right to own guns, the sort of taken out of context notion that guns are available to you even if you don't want them or have them, is effectively a religious belief for many Americans. And to say that it should not exist, to say that it should be changed or it should be denied to some people, is effectively received by a certain subset of our population as saying that your religion is false and you shouldn't adhere to it anymore. And that's why I think, I know that sounds perhaps hyperbolic, but I mean, it's the only way that I could possibly explain the reaction that I received from really intensely disturbed, unhinged people who really would take so much time out of their day to, furiously oppose it. And many of them seemed like they were very angry and didn't know why. But I mean, having been on the receiving end of that, it's like a cult. It's like a religious totem.
Right. Nate, if we could talk about those gun control policies you proposed a little bit, I think those are all great ideas. But I think one missing piece is obviously that each state is different by an accident of history and how we were formed, and we're a federal republic. Every state has its own rules for everything. But, is selling guns one of those things that each state should do differently? I think it should be at a federal level. Maybe the FBI should be the one to enact all of those. And as for the NRA, I think you made a good point about the Black Panthers. A few decades ago, when the Black Panthers were around, obviously the NRA was much more moderate about how everyone should be able to have guns and fighting for those rights. And it shows some of their hypocrisy, pretty similar to how the legally gun owner was murdered by the police in Wisconsin recently, Philando Castile. And I don't think Minnesota, sorry. I don't think you heard anything about the NRA, defending him, right?
They actually came out on record to denounce him and say because he apparently the police said he was smoking marijuana, they basically refused to defend anybody who does drugs, as they said.
Yes, on the federal firearms license, or the paperwork that you have to fill out, and I wrote a story about this for Task and Purpose. There's a box on there that the feds have put on that says that if you've ever that you can't buy a gun if you've ever been used regularly or been addicted to an illegal substance that includes marijuana. Now, even if you are in a state where it's legal, like Colorado or California, still it's federally illegal, so you still cannot legally buy a gun. And it's just this shitty loophole because obviously we all lie to the government. But it's just this like shitty loophole that they put in there for exactly this. Oh, well, he was smoking marijuana, so it's his own fault that he got shot. We don't, he no longer is a legal gun owner because he was high at the time. Now, granted, the last time I went shooting out in the country, I brought along a fucking case of beer with my brother, and we're, cracking beers and shooting shotguns, but that's perfectly fine.
Yeah, I'm not even sure that I would say a conviction for crime necessarily means that you shouldn't be able to own a gun. I mean, obviously conviction for violent crimes, but there are a lot of people who have been convicted of non-violent offenses and sentenced to prison, and that could easily be that is exactly the type of thing that the NRA that I kind of thought existed 10 years ago and clearly never existed would have been around to protect. Like the ACLU version of gun control would have been around to protect, to say like, well, the Nazis were the ones who said, like a certain political class, a certain group of people were had to go to concentration camps, and once you'd been to a concentration camp, you had like all of your rights as a citizen and as a human were heavily restricted. And that's exactly the type of thing that we would be wanting to look out for. But at the same time, yes, if you're a violent criminal, like if you've been convicted of a felony or even a misdemeanor with assault and sent to prison for that, then you shouldn't be able to own a gun. But go ahead.
Yeah, that just raises an interesting point for me because in many states, and I don't know the number, obviously there's no voting rights for people who have had any criminal conviction. So it's more like where our priorities lie in a society, but everybody is allowed to buy a gun, whether you have a criminal conviction or various mental problems. It doesn't matter because it's big business also. The NRA is just a stooge for big business, and the Obama years were, pretty ripe years for them because of the paranoia they could stoke. But actually, I think during these days of the new Trump regime, business probably isn't so good for them. So they're probably looking to fire up their base in some other way, right? To buy more guns.
That's actually one of the points Francis raised with me when I was talking about the photos emerging from the Charlottesville riots and the fact that these militias of Oath Keepers, and many of these militias were from out of state. They traveled from like Pennsylvania or from New York State. That these were not poor people, because if you wouldn't be able to afford that kind of equipment if you were poor. I mean, I suppose you could put it on credit, but you're looking at, anywhere from $1,500 to $5,000 worth of gear that's just visible to the naked eye that these people are wearing. And someone pointed out when I was kind of giving ballpark figures for how much these things cost, they said, because I said that, okay, I've seen stripped down M4s or AR-15s with no guards, no butt stocks, etc., for $450. And somebody linked me to a page and said, no, actually, you can get them a complete one for $400 now because the prices have fallen significantly because people aren't buying them with this kind of, gold rush, bank run kind of mentality, thinking that they're going to be banned and taken off the market. And having seen that, it's strange because the truth is, a friend of mine that I was in a writing program with had worked in finance before, and he mentioned that as kind of a personal hobby, he kept the stock tracker on his phone set to a number of firearms manufacturers because he would invariably see their prices spike whenever there was a mass shooting because people were speculating on the notion that primarily that they thought there would be a run on guns and that would be a time to make money off of the jump in stock prices. Significant, and furthermore, they're invariably going to go down when there wasn't gun control because everyone knew that wasn't going to happen. So one could then also short those stocks once the inevitable price plummet was going to happen after the fact, which is incredibly cynical, but it's just an observation of the reality in which we live.
Yeah, I will say that it is nice that I can pick up 22 ammo again. Last time I went shooting with the local socialist group here, and I could get a box of 500 loose 22 rounds for about $30, which for the last 4 years has been fucking impossible. So, hooray for Trump, I guess. I mean, I can get guns cheap again. ARs, like you said, ARs have dropped down to $300, $400, $500 as long as you don't mind buying something that's a little off-brand.
But that said, I'm an American citizen. I was born in this country. I served in the military for 7 years. You know, I have you'd think every right, every desire to stay here. And my wife and I are planning on leaving and moving to the United Kingdom. And one of the reasons why is because I do not want to have to fear that myself or my wife or our potential children, who will not be white if we do have children, are going to face being shot to death, you know, either by a fellow citizen, by the police, or, you know, or shooting themselves accidentally or intentionally. That it really is, once again, if you want to face the reality in which we live, like, I think that's a huge concern, and that it's a thing you have to factor into your own safety.
Now, David, since you've been in Italy for the last 10 years, and since, if necessary, you wouldn't be able to run and just pick up a gun, are you worried about your government, about the Italian government coming down on you?
No, not at all.
Why not? What makes
Well-
the Italian government so not scary versus the American government?
Well, that's actually quite a long answer. Italy is a great country, beautiful place. Strong governance is not one of their fortes here, but paradoxically, it is still somehow a great society where people live a good lifestyle. It's obviously very safe. That's just a given. I mean, I've never heard of anybody who doesn't feel safe here. There is some xenophobia, which is a bit of a new thing, but it's still a small party thing. It's not like they haven't something equivalent to a Republican Party, that's their entire reason to be. But otherwise, you know, there's free education, mostly free healthcare, which is very good. And yeah, there's no guns floating around everywhere. People get angry at other drivers, but you know, you don't worry about them shooting you through the window.
You just yell at each other, which is what Americans are really good at. Everybody should. That's a thing that, you know, from now on, just can we go back to throwing each other the middle finger or something? Like, now we got to shoot everybody.
I was in a Bed Bath and Beyond in Fayetteville, North Carolina, and there was a guy in there that was open carrying with a 9mm pistol strapped to his hip. And I remember the profound tension in that store, despite the fact that what he was doing was legal. I remember that being very uncomfortable. And I remember thinking to myself, like, if something happens, like, do you really think that, you know, ISIS is going to jump out from behind the fucking toiletries or linens and start engaging you, and you have to dump a magazine at them? I mean, like, it's just such a bizarre notion to me. And then, I don't know, some people really do believe that they have to be strapped anywhere they go.
Yeah, I would just like to say that the man who feels compelled, the man or woman who feels compelled to open carry in a Bed Bath and Beyond is a sad individual. Walk up to that person and offer them some words of support or empathy, because that may be the most vulnerable thing to do. I'm in a Bed Bath and Beyond in the USA somewhere, in the heart of suburbia, by, you know, pound for pound, the safest place you can be, and you're open carrying a pistol. Like that is deeply pathetic. That's not a call for help. That is a Celine Dion song to the world. Here I am, and I've bottomed out. I've hit rock bottom.
You know, and Nate, I think you bring up an interesting point about that feeling like in a Bed Bath and Beyond of tension, because I remember just walking through my neighborhood where I have been mugged at gunpoint. Now, generally, when I'm walking, I'm, you know, with my wife or I'm with my two giant dogs, so I'm really not that, you know, I'm not alone, so I'm not as vulnerable. But I remember like seeing, you know, two older white men sitting on a porch, and one of them had a revolver strapped to the side, and just like I froze. Like I had that moment of just like, because when you just see a gun in the wild, that's not on a cop or not on a security person or not on, you know, a soldier, like it takes my brain a minute, and like I almost crossed the street. Like, you know, like I will cross the street to get away from the old man with the revolver that he's proudly displaying on his hip before I will, you know, the random black guy listening to his iPod walking down the street, because I'm more scared of that old dude, and I don't know why, but it's just that visceral, like,
It's because you're woke,
like,
Francis.
well, it's because possibly, but also just because, you know, it's like, look, what is my neighborhood this terrible? Like, I'm walking my dogs. I'm walking down to my favorite restaurant with my wife and my kid, and this person feels compelled to have a gun. Do I need a gun? Is this a terrible neighborhood? And it's not. Like, but all those things come flooding into my head, and it's just like I have that like feeling of just do I need to go home and get my gun? What are you gonna do with your gun? I don't know you. I don't fucking know who you are, old man with a gun.
Now imagine that, but with nuclear weapons.
Right, but I think
I
it
would
also
be perfectly capable to own nuclear weapons. Thank you.
I think it,
David, I'm sorry I cut you off.
Yeah, it raises a larger point, though, of what society we want to live in. So the only reason for carrying a gun is obviously to kill something, either another person or an animal, both of which I'm strongly against. But otherwise, where would you see people walking around carrying guns? It's a war zone or a martial society. And, is that what we want America to be? I know, Nate, you mentioned earlier about how the Second Amendment is basically a religious belief. And it definitely is with a lot of people, but do we want that to be the case where the Second Amendment is untouchable and a statement of belief and everything else is negotiable or we don't even know about it? The Second Amendment definitely supersedes the First Amendment for most people and everything else about the Constitution, which they don't know anything about. So they only read the Second Amendment, which actually I think they're misreading because it was written at a time, when there were Native Americans on the frontier and also to protect the slave owners from revolt. But, those are not issues anymore. Otherwise, it could be a peaceful society, but it's not. It's the most violent in the world of developed countries.
And I've actually heard it said that, at least in terms of historical interpretations, that the reason why the Second Amendment was written the way that it was is so that the states in the South would not face legal challenges to conscription for slave patrols, because that was the thing in Southern society, that unless you were in a role that was critical to the functioning of your community, like being a doctor or something that was indispensable, you would come up for your sort of National Guard style drill to be on the slave patrol. And those slave patrols were armed, and that had to be stipulated in the Constitution. And the same document that's supposedly inviolable, that literally says black people count as 3/5 of a person, the idea that is must remain inviolable forever really rubs me the wrong way. And like what you just said, David, I agree that to many people, the Second Amendment seems to be the only amendment that counts.
I think that's a really good conversation about guns, and I think we're all in agreement that no matter where we fall on how much somebody should be restricted on guns, there obviously needs to be some kind of restriction on guns, maybe a licensing or something. Jesus, but we gotta stop letting just anybody have a goddamn gun.
But what's the funny thing, though? I realize we have to close this out here shortly, but it feels like we haven't talked about hardly anything. It feels like there's still 150 different angles one has to consider when you look at the gun debate in America, because you haven't even begun to look at the extent to which the position that many sort of centrist liberals take on gun control is that only police should own the guns, and how unbelievably repulsive that idea is to people who have been victimized by police, for example, in certain communities in America. You look at all this, and it's like we're not even barely scratching the surface. And I think that's the thing that's like, on one side, we can say, oh, we wrapped it up, guys. We've come to a unanimous conclusion, but it's not unanimous. And I feel like the thing that makes it so challenging is that just about every angle of this is contentious, no matter who you're talking to, no matter what the audience, no matter what the venue, it's contentious. And it just seems strange that that it's the next thing that's one of the things that's tearing America apart.
Yeah. And Adrian, David, did you have any closing comments you wanted to add?
No, I'm good.
All right. Yeah, and it really is. We could have, there could be an entire...
I think David had something. Go ahead.
No, I have nothing else to add that could be in less than 30 seconds. I agree, Nate. There's a lot more we could talk about. Maybe that should be another part, but, we didn't mention the specific angles about hunting or many, very particular cases. But, yeah, I think we have a general agreement that something should be done. That's always the case, isn't it, though? Anybody remember Newtown? I think everybody agreed in the country something should have been done after that, but now here we are. So I guess we'll keep talking, right?
Yeah, I feel like you could probably do an entire, separate podcast to get into every corner and nuance of gun control in America. So, but that's not this podcast. And next week we're going to talk about something else. I'm sure something else dumb will happen, and we'll talk about that. But you can follow the podcast at Hell of a Way. You can follow me at Army Strang. You can follow Nate at In These Deserts. Adrian is at presumptuous_nominee on Instagram. David, do you have anything to plug, or are you sane enough to be off of Twitter?
Yeah, I'm also a writer at the Rathbearing Tree along with Adrian, so go check that out.
Definitely, Rathbearing Tree has a lot of really good stuff on there. It's a little, Adrian, give me a description of Rathbearing Tree, because I don't feel like you talk about it enough, because it's a really good side writing project that you have going on.
Sure. I like to think that Rathbearing Tree is more of the if Hell of a Way to Die is veterans talking on podcasts about things of interest to burgeoning leftists. I don't know if that's how you pronounce it. Burgeoning? Burgeoning. Damn. I learned something today.
Fucking Yale grads can't even pronounce words.
Hey, I've been in Italy drinking that good red wine for nearly 4 days straight. I'm surprised I'm even coherent right now. I'm basically unconscious. That's what I learned to do at Yale, I think, like most people.
Yeah.
Drink good Italian red wine. Rathbearing Tree is like a mostly written counterpart to that. We do fiction, poetry, essays, book reviews, cultural criticism. Started about 3 or 4 years ago with me, David, and another guy, Mike Carson, who's another contributor to The Road Ahead, another infantry officer. And it's veterans and people who are interested in war talking about, I guess at this point, really issues that collide with war or societies at war. And because America's been at war for 15 years, it's almost anything having to do with America. I strongly encourage anyone to check it out. And I think that Hell of a Way to Die and Rathbearing Tree are very much creatures of the animals of the same family. That's my piece on Rathbearing Tree.
Yeah, Rathbearing Tree is much more philosophical, while this is just a bunch of angry veterans kind of yelling about shit. But, like, if you want, like, actual thoughtful things, Rathbearing Tree is fantastic for that.
I also tried to recruit Nate Buffet for it several times and leaned on him pretty heavily, but he, for whatever reason, he had his own projects going on.
Fucking called out.
I'll try to publish. I mean, I don't think I'm anywhere near enough of an ascetic warrior monk to publish in the Rathbearing Tree, Adrian, but I'll try. I'll give it a shot. I'll start doing pull-ups.
You have to do mind pull-ups. That's what you need to start.
He doesn't. He's there already. He's there. All he needs to do is sit there, is crack the laptop open and make that magic happen with his fingers. But he knows that.
All right. Before Carl has to start taking too much out of this episode, we'll talk to you guys next week. And David, thank you so much for being on the podcast with us.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. Thanks.
Later, guys. Have a good one.
Take care.
All right, so that's kind of I'm trying to figure out what I want to do with streaming and the podcast. I'm thinking of doing this, but I also kind of have a side gig, side podcast idea that I'm working on. So we're gonna kind of, we'll look into doing more of that as well. Ooh, steal his motorbike. Kind of doing pretty much exactly that, where I'm, just kind of playing shit while the recording goes on in the background. But it would be, I'm thinking of getting like more philosophical leftists to talk about shit, and then we'll still do this. I mean, this seemed pretty cool, and it's just like here's a way that you can listen to it, not necessarily, I want to get the podcast to as many people as humanly possible. So this will, this is one of them. So, and I did pretty much, I recorded this whole stream along with the podcast itself, and I'm gonna throw that up on YouTube and see what we can do with that. I haven't come across a single fucking person in this game so far. It's like, of course, the episode episode ends, and it's like, okay, I still have to keep playing. I can't just fucking drop out of this. But yeah, the whole philosophical idea, I think it'll be a fun idea. We'll see how it goes. I already have a couple people who said that they're interested. But it would pretty much just be, where do you see leftism today, and where do you see it, in the future? I've got a couple people that, you know, everybody's got a different idea basically, and I want to get those ideas. I want to hear what everybody has to say about where they think where they think things should be in 10, 15, 30 years or whatever, and where they think it might be, if it's going to be a worthwhile thing or not. So we'll see how that goes, and that'll be, maybe once or twice a month, along with all the other stuff. I've got a bunch of older games that are up and running too. I managed to get the old what is it? Fucking Curse of Monkey Island up and running, the good one. So I will be getting that going soon on some gaming, and just doing a bunch of stuff. I haven't done anything. Oh fuck! No. I haven't really been able to come up with a schedule, and of course at the end of the month I'm gonna be out of town, and then I've got a bunch of other shit that's going on between my job and my side shit and the military. Like, I got some classes I got to do for the military, so I'm gonna be out for that, and so there's a lot going on. And it'll be, no, I like that. Not being attacked by zombies. And I don't, and that's, oh, there we go. There's somebody. Jesus. Oh, fuck. Fuck. Should have had it on. I think I had it on single. Ugh. But anyway, so there's gonna be not a lot of scheduled shit until probably end of September, early October. But we'll keep trying to do this and doing stuff. Apparently, I can get affiliated through Twitch, which might be pretty cool because that kind of gets me a little bit further along. Basically, the only thing I have to do for that is put in the time to stream. And if any of y'all got a toddler, you know how difficult that can be when you got, a bunch of other shit going on, especially, just actual work and stuff. So, but this was a lot of fun, and so yeah, I'm gonna throw this up on YouTube as well, and kind of put that out, and hopefully we're gonna get some other shit going. So, as always, thanks for being on the stream, and thanks for watching.